The 24th of October 1944, the bridge of Yamato in the Sibuyan Sea, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stood over the chart as his center force drove east in column. Sea room opened on every side. Gray lights sat on the water, and lookouts kept searching the sky above battleships built for a different kind of fight. The screws kept turning. The force still had weight, order, and purpose. The warning signs were already behind him. On the 23rd of October, submarines had struck in Palawan Passage. Heavy cruisers had been lost, and the force had been discovered. Kurita continued the advance anyway, under Operation Shō-Gō, refusing to abandon the thrust toward Leyte Gulf after the first blows had already fallen. That was the decision on the water that morning. Armor, night passage, gun range, transports, and escort carriers ahead. From Yamato's bridge, the old answer still looked like an answer. His main attack force was still moving. But the American answer waiting for Kurita was not another battle line beyond the horizon. On the 24th of October, 1944, in the Sibuyan Sea, fast carrier strike operations from Task Force 38 were already turning contact into repeated punishment against the same ships before his guns could reach the landing area. By the end of that day, Musashi would be sunk, and Kurita's thrust would be turned back westward before it could break the American landing area. The central figure was brutal and simple. Musashi took 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs. That outcome mattered because Kurita was not leading a token raid or a sacrificial screen. He commanded the main attack force inside the Japanese plan for Leyte Gulf, the strongest surface thrust available for the approach through the central Philippines. Around him moved Yamato, Musashi, Nagato, Kongō, Haruna, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers, all driving toward a battle that Japanese doctrine still treated as the proper decision point of the campaign. The shape of that belief sat in steel all around him, battleships at the core, cruisers as blades around them, destroyers screening a force meant to endure punishment, pass through, and strike at close range once it reached the waters off Leyte. Even after the submarine disaster of the 23rd of October, center force still existed as a coherent instrument. It had been cut, but not stopped. Kurita had survived. The column still moved. That was the stake on the 24th of October. Not one ship alone, not even Musashi alone, but whether a surface-striking force, built around armor and heavy guns, could still cross open water under American observation and arrive in shape to do the work it had been assembled to do. If it reached the landing area, the danger to the invasion shipping was not abstract. Kurita's force carried battleships for that purpose and had come to use them. This is why the morning confidence mattered. Continuing east after Palawan was not routine movement, it was commitment. The mission had already drawn blood from his force, and still he pressed on, because the operation required arrival, timing, and weight. Every hour counted. Every major hull still afloat counted. Every turn of the column carried the assumption that enough of the striking power remained intact to force the issue later. And Musashi stood near the center of that assumption. One of the two Yamato-class battleships in the force, she represented the part of Japanese naval power that was supposed to survive what broke lesser ships. Her mere presence inside the formation widened the meaning of the day. If a force that included Musashi and Yamato could be checked in open water before it reached its battlefield, then the loss would be larger than tonnage. Kurita did not yet have to admit any of that. From his side of the sea, the column still had order. Engines still answered. Signals still passed. The attack still possessed scale. Even discovered, even struck the day before, center force was still the largest sharp object Japan could put into that corridor at that hour. Men in the force could still tell themselves what surface sailors had always told themselves under pressure. Endure the approach, preserve formation, keep moving, and let the decisive exchange come later. The ships around Kurita had been built, trained, and sent for exactly that logic. On paper, the force still justified belief. The trouble was that paper strength no longer set the pace of the day. A staff could insist the route remained open. A battleship could absorb punishment and still float. A commander could continue the mission after the first losses. None of that answered the fact, already bearing down from the east. The force kept going because it still believed it could arrive. The number waiting inside the day said otherwise. Musashi would take 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs. Kurita had not yet seen what that total would do to the plan. While that count still lay ahead, Kurita's force went on, moving through the Sibuyan Sea under orders that had not changed. The morning sea gave room to maneuver but not concealment. Battleships held their stations. Cruisers and destroyers worked around them, and every man in the column understood that the mission was still alive only if the force kept its cohesion and its time. This was the world on Yamato's bridge after Palawan. Damage had already narrowed the margin. Discovery had already stripped away surprise. Yet the operational instinct remained the same. Push through, reach the strait, bring the heavy ships into the waters where surface fire could matter. The formation did not need confidence spoken aloud. It was there in the continued advance of a force that had already taken losses and still refused to break off. What pressed on those decks was not panic but strain. Lookouts searched upward. Anti-aircraft crews waited at their weapons. Signal traffic mattered more with every hour because a force of this size could not absorb delay as easily as it could absorb isolated damage. Time was becoming material. Formation was becoming material. The plan depended on both. Kurita's command also carried the burden of scale. Center Force was not a single flagship making a dash for glory. It was a mass of capital ships and escorts whose value rested in coordinated arrival. A damaged cruiser hurt. Lost heavy cruisers hurt more. But the deeper danger was cumulative. Every prior blow thinned the shield around the main body and made the remaining force more dependent on keeping order under pressure. That is what gave the American presence its weight before the worst damage was even visible. Task Force 38 did not need to trade ships with Kurita to alter the terms of the day. Its aircraft were already forcing his side to think in interruptions, headings, and survival windows, instead of in a clean run toward Leyte. The route still existed on the chart. On the water, it was starting to fray. The old surface logic still tempted them onward because the force itself still looked formidable. Yamato was there. Musashi was there. Nagato, Kongō, Haruna, and the rest of the column still represented a striking power no commander on that side could dismiss lightly. A Japanese officer could stand on a bridge wing, look down the line of wakes and turrets, and still believe the force retained enough strength to reach the decisive area if it endured what was coming. That belief is what made the coming damage more than physical. Kurita was not merely preserving ships, he was preserving sequence. The mission required a force that could arrive with enough order, enough speed, and enough concentration to matter at the point of contact. Once those began to erode, survival alone would not save the operation. From the enemy side, that distinction was not yet final. The column still moved. The heavy guns were still with him. The sea room still lay open ahead. A commander in that position could tell himself the day had not decided anything yet, that punishment on the approach did not equal defeat, that a force this large could still force passage if it kept going long enough. His ships answered that thought by staying in line and driving on. The force still trusted its armor. It still trusted its mission. It still trusted that the proper battle lay ahead, not above. Then the sky began to make that faith expensive. The force had already survived submarine attack and still advanced. That was its own answer. The day waiting over the Sibuyan Sea would answer with 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs. Kurita was still commanding a battleship thrust built to break into Leyte. He had not yet learned what kind of naval power had made that idea old. From Brunei, the force had sailed as the main blade of the Japanese plan. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded center force, and the ships under him were not assembled for escort duty or attrition. They were assembled for a breakthrough. Yamato and Musashi stood at the core, with Nagato, Kongō, and Haruna beside them, screened by heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers. The doctrine behind them was older than the voyage from Brunei. Endure the approach, pass the outer blows, reach close waters, use heavy guns against the invasion anchorage. That logic gave Musashi her meaning. She was one of the Yamato class, built around 946-centimeter guns and armor meant to take punishment that would cripple lesser battleships. A ship like that was not simply a unit in the order of battle. She was proof cast in steel. If the Americans had to stop Kurita on the sea, then ships like Musashi were supposed to be the reason they failed. The force did not begin this operation in retreat or confusion. It began with a mission and a timetable. Brunei was the departure point because the route had to carry Kurita north, through Palawan Passage, and then into the central Philippines. That route accepted risk, but Japanese doctrine accepted risk with it. Surface power did not need comfort. It needed arrival. The men around Kurita had been trained for the moment when a battle line still mattered. When a force of battleships and cruisers, could survive the approach and settle the issue at gun range. Then came the 23rd of October, 1944. In Palawan Passage, American submarines hit first. Otago was lost. Maya was lost. Takao was forced back. Kurita survived the attack and transferred his flag. That mattered inside the force, because the old test of command had always begun there. A commander absorbed the first shock, restored order, and continued the mission if the striking power still existed. Center force had been cut hard on the 23rd of October, but it had not dissolved. The battleships were still there. The remaining cruisers and destroyers were still there. The plan, damaged but alive, still pointed east. That was how the reputation grew. Not in stories told later, but in the sequence itself. Losses in Palawan Passage. A flag transfer under pressure. Then, continuation under Operation Shō-Gō. A weaker commander might have broken off after losing 2 heavy cruisers and seeing another turn back. Kurita did not. He took the surviving mass forward because Japanese naval doctrine still treated concentration of heavy ships as an answer that could redeem earlier losses. And in a narrow military sense, that belief had evidence behind it. A surface force built around 5 battleships still represented crushing firepower once it reached an exposed landing area. Yamato, Musashi, Nagato, Kongō, and Haruna were not symbolic names on a chart. They were guns, armor, speed, and command weight. Heavy cruisers extended the blow. Destroyers kept the screen intact. The formation existed to hit transports and escort carriers after the passage, not to win an argument in open daylight. So the circle around Kurita held together. Officers signaled. Engines answered. The surviving ships accepted the losses of the 23rd of October as the price already paid to get closer to the real battlefield. From their side of the line, the method still worked because the force still existed in fighting shape and still moved toward the objective it had been built to reach. A Japanese officer could look at that surviving column and say the force had taken its first wound and kept marching. 5 battleships still carried the mission. The 24th of October, 1944. Sibuyan Sea. The first American carrier strikes reached Kurita in open water, and the old answer did not fail at once. Center force was still moving. Battleships still held the center. Cruisers and destroyers still screened. Anti-aircraft fire rose from a formation that had no intention of conceding the day after a single round of attacks. From the Japanese side, that first contact could still be read as punishment to endure, not a barrier that could not be crossed. Kurita had reason to read it that way because his force still possessed structure. Yamato, Nagato, Kongō, and Haruna remained in company. Musashi was hit, but she remained with the force through the early attacks. Formation changes were made. Course changes were made. Yet the command itself did not collapse into scattered ships seeking only escape. The force was still being handled as a surface striking body, still trying to preserve enough order to continue toward San Bernardino Strait. That was a dangerous reassurance. The doctrine seemed to confirm itself one more time. Armor held. Guns remained. The force answered air attack not by surrendering the mission, but by adjusting under it. A commander bred in decisive fleet doctrine could still tell himself that the Americans had spent aircraft and inflicted damage, but had not yet removed the instrument that mattered. The decisive power of center force still appeared to lie in the battleships that remained underway. The Americans were already more than a single interruption, but from Kurita's bridge the pattern could still be misread. Aircraft came in, attacked, and departed. The sea was not covered by American warships closing for a surface fight. No carrier stood inside his gun range. What he could see was damage, maneuvers, delay, and the immediate need to keep formation. What he could not yet reduce to a formula was why the pressure did not end with the departure of one strike. That uncertainty mattered because it let confidence harden instead of break. Center force had already survived the 23rd of October in Palawan Passage. Now on the 24th of October it had taken the first strikes in the Sibuyan Sea and still remained a force in being. The command still issued signals. The column still answered. The mission toward Leyte had not yet been formally abandoned. To men trained to value endurance, that looked like proof. Even Musashi's early damage could be folded into that reading. A battleship of her size was expected to absorb punishment. That was part of the investment made in her from the beginning. If she could still move after bomb and torpedo hits in the first part of the day, then the faith inside the force was simple. Endure this wave. Close the distance later. Finish the work where battleships decided things. Kurita's side could still count what remained rather than what had already been spent. 4 other battleships were still with him. The screen still existed. The route ahead had not vanished from the chart, so the first conclusion drawn under fire was not that the old method was dead. It was that the old method had been tested again, and still stood on steel. Kurita could still believe the force had taken the blow and kept its purpose. 4 battleships still ran beside the damaged giant. The 24th of October, 1944. Sibuyan Sea. Then, the arithmetic began to slip. American aircraft did not strike once and leave the day behind them. They came back in waves. Kurita could count the surviving battleships after the early attacks and still see a powerful force. But every return by carrier aircraft added new damage, new course changes, and new delay. The count of heavy ships still looked strong. The count of attacks refused to stay finished. That was the first fact that no longer fit. A surface commander could accept one raid, absorb losses, and continue on schedule. Kurita still had 5 battleships in his force at the start of the 24th of October. He still had 4, undamaged enough to continue, after Musashi began falling behind. Yet the timetable that should have belonged to a surviving battle line was already being consumed by aircraft that kept reappearing over the same water. At 12:43 on the 24th of October 1944 in the Sibuyan Sea, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita ordered a temporary turn to the west. That was not surrender, it was adjustment under pressure, meant to evade and regroup while American attacks continued. But a westward turn by the main attack force had a countable cost. It reversed the axis of advance of 5 battleships in the middle of the day and gave away time the operation had no reserve to spare. Later on the 24th of October 1944, still in the Sibuyan Sea, Kurita turned east again and resumed the advance toward San Bernardino Strait. That movement proved the old will was still alive. He had not abandoned the mission after the first shocks from the air. But the resumed advance carried a different shape now. Musashi was dropping astern. The force that turned back east was not moving on its original morning schedule, and a delay measured in hours mattered as much as visible damage to armor. The deeper alarm sat inside that mismatch. Kurita had done what a surface commander was supposed to do. He maneuvered. He preserved the main body. He resumed the advance. The force still existed, yet each adjustment bought less than it cost, because new American aircraft appeared before the previous interruption could be absorbed. The route remained open on the chart, but control of the day had shifted upward into the air over the column. A Japanese officer could still say the order stood and the advance had resumed. He could still point to 4 battleships continuing east after Musashi lost her place in the formation. That was the last comfort available in numbers. The force was still moving, but it was no longer moving on the time its plan required. Kurita could order another turn and still not get the lost hours back. 4 battleships were still pushing toward the strait. By mid-afternoon in the Sibuyan Sea, the pattern had become administrative. Contact reports brought another launch. Deck crews on the American fast carriers turned aircraft around again, and Kurita's force paid for that repeatability in minutes and miles. He had already turned west once, and then east again. Now every ship under him had to navigate not one attack, but the interval before the next one. The loss was no longer abstract. He was losing freedom of movement. Musashi showed it first in a way the rest of the force could measure. Torpedo damage reduced her speed. Bomb damage added to the burden. She began to lag. A battleship that had been part of the center became a problem of spacing, escort, and time. When one of the heaviest ships in the formation could no longer keep the same pace, Kurita lost the ability to concentrate his force where he wanted it. He could push on with the faster body or adjust around the crippled giant. Either choice spent the plan. The next subtraction was defensive space. In open water there was room to turn, but not room to disappear. Every evasive maneuver widened intervals, disrupted screens, and made station keeping harder for cruisers and destroyers already carrying the burden of anti-aircraft defense. A surface force built to arrive in order was being forced to survive in fragments of order instead. The issue was not whether the ships still floated. It was whether they could reach the strait as a unified weapon. By late afternoon, that answer was narrowing. Then came the quiet fear inside procedure. Musashi had to be escorted as she fell astern. Other heavy units continued, but they continued without the full shield they had begun with that morning. The force still had Yamato, Nagato, Kongō, and Haruna in company, yet the center of gravity had shifted. One part of Kurita's command was now trying to advance, while another part was trying to keep a shattered battleship alive long enough to clear the sea. He had lost a single timetable and inherited two incompatible tasks. That split cost reach. Orders in such a force depended on speed, visibility, and obedience under strain. Damage to one major ship became drag on all signals around her. Escorts assigned to a falling battleship were escorts no longer tightening the screen around the main body. A commander could still order advance, turn, or regroup. He could not make a damaged capital ship recover station by signal alone. What was leaving him now was not courage. It was command range in practical terms. The American attacks kept turning that practical loss into arithmetic. Multiple waves over one day meant that repair parties, anti-aircraft crews, and engine rooms never got a clean interval to restore margin. Men fought flooding. Gunners kept firing. Helm orders kept changing. Yet no completed action ended the sequence. Each effort merely carried the ship to the next attack. That was the attrition the battleship force had not been designed to solve. It was losing experienced function faster than drills could restore it. As the afternoon deepened, Kurita still chose movement over paralysis. The main body continued toward San Bernardino Strait. But the movement itself now proved the reduction. The battleship had dropped behind. Formation integrity had been traded for any speed the survivors could still make. The force that remained ahead was still dangerous, but it was dangerous in a smaller, looser, later form than the one that had entered the Sibuyan Sea. The Americans had not erased his command. They had stripped away the conditions under which it had meaning. Musashi's own end approached as a matter of accumulation. Flooding increased. The list grew. Counter-flooding could only buy time. The ship's armor had done what it was built to do, and that was no longer enough, because armor could preserve steel longer than it could preserve the operation built around that steel. Once she was no longer keeping station, Kurita's strongest visible symbol had become a delaying wreck inside his advance. A staff assessment at that stage did not need panic. It needed subtraction. One battleship dropping astern. One force divided between advance and survival. One afternoon lost in repeated attack. I can still proceed, but no longer as ordered. One battleship was falling out of the force. The machine that made that subtraction possible was still launching. Late afternoon brought the answer to the unresolved fact. The attacks kept returning because the American fast carriers were not conducting a single interception. They were running a system of search, strike, recovery, and relaunch that could revisit the same contact through the day as long as the target remained in reach. Kurita had been reading each wave as an event to survive. The American institution treated each wave as one cycle inside a larger routine. That was why the count never stayed closed. From the Japanese side, the consequences were immediate. A countermeasure against one raid did not solve the next raid because the next raid was generated by the same decks, the same task force organization, and the same operating day. A westward turn could buy space from one attack group. It could not cancel the next launch already being armed and sent. Heavy anti-aircraft fire could thicken the approach. It could not strike the carriers themselves. The adjustment always remained tactical. The pressure remained operational. Kurita did what a competent surface commander could do. He changed course. He altered formation. He resumed the advance after turning away. He accepted the loss of neat cohesion in exchange for preserving the surviving striking body. None of that was irrational. The problem was that each adjustment consumed exactly what his mission could not spare: time, spacing, concentration. By the time a maneuver had yielded its benefit, the American cycle had generated another attack window. This is why the return eastward mattered less as defiance than as proof of reduced options. He could not remain indefinitely in the Sibuyan Sea under recurring carrier attack. He could not answer Task Force 38 with a surface action. He could not recover Musashi's full value. His remaining choice was to push the surviving body onward and hope enough power still reached the strait to matter later. That was not restoration of control. It was a gamble launched from inside a timetable already broken. The Japanese command tried to preserve doctrine by reducing ambition in practice. Protect the core battleships. Keep moving. Accept straggling. Let damaged units fall behind if the main body could still pass San Bernardino Strait. That was a severe adaptation for a force whose design depended on concentrated arrival. It meant conceding that the plan could no longer be executed in the shape in which it had begun that morning. Yet even this reduced form still failed to solve the central issue. The Americans did not need to sink every ship. They only needed to keep imposing delay and damage on the force that was trying to arrive. The same logic made replacement impossible at the operational level. A damaged battleship could not be replaced that day. Lost time could not be replaced at all. Escorts drawn off for a crippled ship could not screen two places at once. Men exhausted by repeated action could keep functioning, but not at the standard with which the mission had started. The institution behind Kurita could still issue orders. It could not regenerate a fresh center force between one carrier cycle and the next. By evening, the demonstration was plain from the enemy side. Surface doctrine still possessed ships, guns, and brave crews. What it did not possess was control over approach under American carrier reach. Kurita's adjustments had not been foolish. They had been insufficient by design, because they worked within the limits of a surface force, while the Americans were fighting with a repeatable air-sea routine beyond his gun range. That was the beginning of desperation. Proceed anyway. Preserve what can still move. Except that one principal battleship is being written off in order to keep the rest of the body alive for the next phase. Such choices do not mark a force at ease in its own arithmetic. They mark a commander who knows the alternatives are gone and moves, because standing still is worse. The enemy conclusion at the waterline was colder than drama. We were attacked continuously by carrier planes. That continuity was the fact that broke the day. One principal battleship had been reduced to a straggler. The fall now had a time and a hull waiting for it. Toward evening in the Sibuyan Sea, the final approach to disaster still looked procedural from parts of Kurita's command. The main body kept moving. Signals still passed. Escorts still worked around damaged ships. Nothing in that sequence required a confession. It required endurance for another hour. But the shape of the force had changed. Musashi was no longer a shield and station. She was a battered battleship trying to survive long enough to remain afloat, while the rest of the operation slipped ahead without her. On board Musashi, the work had narrowed to damage control and survival. Flooding spread through compartments already hit earlier in the day. Counter-flooding measures fought list with list. Engine power fell off. The ship had once embodied excess protection. By late afternoon, that protection was being spent room by room. What mattered to the men inside her was no longer Lake Gulf. It was pumps, valves, communications, fire, and angle of heel. Kurita, now committed to preserving what remained of center force, let the main body continue. That decision stated the institutional crisis without a shouted quarrel. A commander of the main attack force had reached the point where one of his strongest ships could not be carried forward inside the original design. To save the operation in any form, he had to stop trying to save it in its original form. Musashi would be left to her own fight with the sea while the rest pressed on. The American face remained impersonal and repeated. Carrier air groups from Task Force 38 arrived in successive waves over open water and attacked the same force again and again. No American battleship needed to appear over the horizon. No surface screen needed to close the range. The attacks came from outside Kurita's chosen battle. From the Japanese side, that was the final humiliation of the mechanism. The force had brought the largest guns it possessed, and could not bring them to bear on the institution deciding its fate. As evening closed in, Musashi's survival margin ended. The accumulated torpedo damage had wrecked buoyancy and control. Bomb damage had compounded topside destruction and internal disorder. The list became fatal. The great ship that had been meant to absorb punishment beyond ordinary naval limits now showed the limit in full view of the rest of the force. She rolled and sank in the Sibuyan Sea that evening. Kurita survived the day. Musashi did not. The loss did not annihilate center force on the spot. Yamato, Nagato, Kongō, and Haruna remained. Cruisers and destroyers remained. The force could still move westward and later move again. But the break had happened. The strongest visible symbol inside the formation was gone before the force had reached the battlefield it had been built to enter. From then on, every further movement belonged to a damaged remainder, not to the intact striking body that had begun the day. For the Japanese sailors nearest the sinking, the moment was material before it was historical. Men went into the water. Escorts had to rescue survivors while still operating in a threatened sea. A battleship's final outcome was one event. The force around her inherited several more. Rescue consumed attention. Separation widened. The surviving main body moved on, carrying not just fewer hulls, but fewer hands immediately available for the next phase. Then the figures made the break impossible to deny. 2 heavy cruisers had already been lost on the 23rd of October before the Sibuyan Sea attacks ever reached full effect. By the end of the 24th of October, 1 Yamato-class battleship had been sunk. American carrier aircraft had struck in repeated waves across the day. Kurita survived and Center Force survived, but not as the force that had entered the Sibuyan Sea on schedule and in full concentration. The numbers on Musashi stood alone because they needed no help. 19 torpedoes, 17 bombs, 1 battleship sunk. Those were not the statistics of an incidental air attack. They were the record of a capital ship beaten down in sequence, until armor, discipline, and scale no longer preserved the mission wrapped around them. A survivor's reaction from that side does not need ornament. Musashi could endure no more. 1 battleship had gone to the bottom, and Kurita's remaining force was already moving into the night without the plan it had started with. And on the 25th of October 1944, the force still reached Samar. That is what makes the tally at the end so hard. Musashi was gone. Atago was gone. Maya was gone. 3 major ships were moved from Center Force before the campaign ended. Kurita still brought 4 battleships through San Bernardino Strait. He still reached waters where his guns could finally matter. But he did it a day late, against a different target set, under a different operational reality, and without the timetable Shō-Gō required. The losses around him kept mounting. Chokai was lost. Chikuma was lost. Suzuya was lost. Later, on the 26th of October 1944, Noshiro was sunk. Kongō was sunk in November while retreating toward home waters. By the end of the war, the surface force that had entered the Sibuyan Sea as Japan's main striking body had been cut down to fragments. The sequence after Musashi matters because it ran in order, not all at once, the 25th of October. Kurita passed the strait in darkness and fell on the American escort carrier group off Samar at first light. He still had reach, he still had mass, but the attack that had been designed to break into the Leh landing area arrived displaced in time and place. It struck fighting ships at sea instead of the anchorage it had been meant to smash. That morning, under resistance, smoke, confusion, and the strain already carried out of the Sibuyan Sea, Kurita broke off. The force then withdrew back through San Bernardino Strait. In the same wider operation, the Japanese Navy spent more carriers, more cruisers, more destroyers, and more trained airmen trying to hold together a plan that had already lost its center of gravity.